I was driving through the night in mid-August, heading from Bozeman to Helena in my old RV. The road was narrow, winding, and flanked on both sides by thick Montana forest, the kind that swallows up light and sound until it feels like nothing exists beyond your headlights. I had been on the road for hours, fatigue pressing against my eyes, but I kept going because I wanted to reach Helena before sunrise. The air smelled dry and faintly of pine, and the sky above was clear, dark enough to make the stars burn sharp and cold. Somewhere near Willow Creek, the engine shuddered violently and then died. The RV coasted to a stop on the shoulder, the headlights barely illuminating the edge of the road and the deep black of the trees beyond. I tried to restart it. The ignition turned, the engine coughed, but it refused to catch. I reached for the small toolkit I kept under the passenger seat and tried checking the connections, the fuel line, anything I could see without crawling under the vehicle. Nothing worked. As I sat there in the sudden silence, a low humming noise began, faint at first, almost imperceptible over the wind brushing the pines. It wasn't regular, like a motor or an engine. It was distorted, uneven, almost like the sound of metal vibrating at different pitches. I turned the headlights toward the tree-line, straining to see, but there was nothing. The shadows of the trees shifted subtly, but there was no movement that should have caused it. I told myself it was the wind, the resonance of the old RV against the asphalt, or a distant vehicle I couldn't see yet. I checked my phone. No signal. Not even a single bar. I felt a tightening in my chest, the sort of pressure that comes when you realize you are entirely cut off. I decided I would wait it out in the RV. I locked the doors and tried to get comfortable, lying on the narrow bed that ran along the side of the vehicle. The humming persisted, irregular now, sometimes louder, sometimes almost disappearing, as if it were moving closer and farther. My imagination tried to fill in the blanks. At one point, I thought I saw something between the trees, a darker shadow against darker shadows, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, a reflection of my own tension. I tried to breathe steadily, telling myself I was fine. Hours passed. I could feel the night stretching, slow and deliberate. The humming changed, almost like a distorted engine idling, not constant but cyclical. I rolled over and stared at the ceiling, the small fluorescent light above flickering as if acknowledging my presence. My ears were ringing slightly, a subtle pain from listening for hours without interruption. Every so often, the RV shook slightly. At first I thought it was the wind, but the forest was still. No branches bent, no leaves fell. I wondered if an animal had brushed against the side, maybe a deer or a moose, but the sound didn't match anything I'd ever heard in the wilderness. I kept my eyes on the windows, the tree-line pressed against the thin glass, and I noticed patterns I hadn't before. Branches aligned at odd angles, dark shapes that didn't belong, a flicker at the edge of my vision that vanished when I looked directly. I told myself it was just my mind, fatigue playing tricks, but it gnawed at me. The air inside the RV was warm, slightly stale, carrying the smell of upholstery and the faint metallic tang of oil and engine fluid. I opened a window slightly to let in fresh air, but the scent of pine mixed with dust and damp soil reminded me I was in the middle of nowhere. I tried to sleep, lying on my back with my hands over my face. I could hear the distant sound of water somewhere, a creek or a drainage ditch, and the soft rustle of leaves. But underneath that was the humming. Every now and then it seemed to shift in tone, as if something had moved in the trees. I forced myself to ignore it, focusing on my breathing, counting slowly, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Hours crawled by. The hum never stopped. I considered leaving the RV, walking to the nearest highway sign or mile marker, but the thought of stepping into complete darkness alone, with unknown eyes watching, froze me. By the first hint of dawn, the RV suddenly coughed to life. The engine rattled briefly and then ran steadily, as though it had never failed. I stared at the dashboard in disbelief, hands hovering over the steering wheel. I checked the fuel gauge, the oil, everything I could see. Nothing was wrong. I shut the doors, unlocked them, and sat for a few moments longer listening. The humming had stopped. The forest was quiet except for the natural sounds of early morning, birds, a distant stream, wind through the pines. I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to release, though the memory of the night's sound stayed with me. I started driving again, keeping my eyes on the road, watching for anything unusual. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting pale light over the trees, turning the shadows into shapes that were less threatening in the daylight. When I passed Willow Creek proper, I noticed the road signs, the small homes set back from the road, the occasional barn. Everything looked normal, peaceful. I felt a wash of relief, but also an undercurrent of unease. I knew what I had felt, the isolation, the sense of being watched, and I couldn't explain it. Later, in Helena, I parked the RV and checked it over again. Mechanically, everything was fine. I even asked a local mechanic, who insisted it was probably a minor fuel issue, something that might have caused the engine to stall once and then resolve itself. It made sense logically, but it didn't erase the feeling of being stranded, the oppressive quiet, the hum that had filled the night. I kept thinking about the shadows at the edge of the road, moving in ways that shouldn't have been possible without drawing attention. Nothing was ever visible, nothing tangible, but it had been there. I never drove that route alone at night again. I stick to daylight now, even if it adds hours to the trip. Sometimes I think about what might have been out there in the trees, whether it was someone else, a vehicle, or just the way darkness plays tricks. But the memory is vivid. I remember the smell of the forest, the way the RV's interior felt warm yet confined, the low hum that refused to stop, and the strange comfort of finally starting the engine and driving away. I know it was something ordinary, something explainable. But for a few hours near Willow Creek, I was completely alone, completely exposed, and completely uncertain about what watched me through the night. Even now, whenever I pass that stretch of road, I slow down. The forest looks the same as it did that night, dense and quiet, the shadows long even in daylight. I remember the sensation of being stranded, of hearing a sound that shouldn't exist, and the weight of absolute isolation. The RV started on its own, yes, and I drove away safely. But I will never forget the tension, the oppressive quiet, and the feeling that for one long night, I was not just alone but seen. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was something far simpler and far more unsettling. The possibility that the world could hold attention without revealing itself, and I was caught in its gaze until the light came. I drove into Cedar Hollow just as the last hints of sunset faded behind the hills. The town was smaller than I expected, a scattering of houses and a main street that ended abruptly at the edge of the forest. My headlights caught the worn signs of old shops and a few abandoned storefronts, their windows dusty and cracked. I had come for the old mill, a crumbling brick building on the far side of town, and I knew I'd have only a few hours to photograph it before night fully claimed the sky. Everyone in town had warned me about the mill. They said it was haunted, that workers had died there decades ago, that the air inside carried the weight of old accidents. I didn't believe any of it, but there was something in the way they said it, uneasy, cautious, that made me approach it carefully. The road to the mill was narrow and lined with maples that had already shed most of their leaves. The wind rustled through the branches, and the crunch of dead leaves under my tires was the only sound for long stretches. By the time I reached the parking area in front of the mill, it was fully dark. The streetlights near the building flickered sporadically, casting pools of weak light and leaving large patches of shadow. The mill itself was massive, 3 stories of brick and weathered wood, with broken windows and rusted metal fittings that gleamed in the headlights. I parked and grabbed my camera bag, checking the lenses before stepping toward the building. The main entrance was a heavy wooden door with iron hinges, and I pushed it slowly. It creaked sharply, echoing across the empty interior. Inside, the air was dense with dust, a mix of soot and rust that made my throat tighten. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I moved carefully, the camera strap against my shoulder, photographing beams of moonlight that filtered through broken windows. Shadows stretched across the walls, shifting with every small movement. I tried to focus on the structure, the textures of brick and wood, the old machinery that had been left in place. Large gears sat coated in dust, some half buried under piles of debris. The smell of damp wood and rusted metal was sharp, a tangible weight in the cold air. As I moved further into the building, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I assumed it was the echo of my own movements, the boards shifting, the wind rattling through broken panes, but the rhythm didn't match. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. The sound came again, soft and deliberate, not a stumble or a squeak from the old floorboards, but deliberate, as if someone were walking carefully on purpose. My pulse quickened, and I tightened my grip on the camera. I scanned the shadows, trying to catch something moving, but the darkness seemed solid, impenetrable. I continued to move, slower now, photographing the machinery along the wall. A line of old looms, rusted and frozen mid-motion, caught my attention. Dust motes floated in the narrow beams of light, and I watched them for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. Then I noticed shapes on the wall, shadows that shifted independently of me. I froze. They stretched and contracted in ways that made no sense. I turned slowly, pointing the camera toward them, but the lens revealed nothing. Empty space, broken boards, heaps of debris. The footsteps came again, this time closer. I could hear the soft scuff of shoes on wood, deliberate and slow, keeping a distance but following. I told myself I was imagining it. The building was old. The wind moved through cracks in the walls, floors settled unevenly. I could be hearing everything wrong. But the sound persisted, and the shapes continued to flicker on the walls. My stomach twisted, a tight knot of panic. I realized I had no idea what I would do if someone, or something, was actually in here. I had no phone signal, the town was empty, and the nearest house was too far to reach in minutes. I decided to leave. I walked backward toward the main door, keeping my eyes on the shifting shadows, trying to move without making noise. The door was still closed when I reached it, but as I pressed against it, it swung open slowly, creaking with a long, deliberate sound. I jumped back, heart hammering, and the camera slipped in my hands, dangling from the strap. I didn't stop to pick it up. I ran. Outside, the air was sharp with cold, and the wind carried the smell of fallen leaves and wet earth. I sprinted across the parking area toward my car, leaves crunching under my feet, the empty streets of Cedar Hollow stretching on either side. My hands shook violently, my breath came in sharp gasps, and I could feel the chill in my lungs. I reached the car, slammed the door shut, and locked it, sliding down into the seat. The headlights cast light on the mill, and I forced myself to look back. The door was closed again, but there was a sense that something had shifted inside, that the building had responded to me. I sat there for a long time, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the flickering streetlights and the dark outline of the mill. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, wind, settling boards, my imagination, but the feeling of being followed, of being watched, lingered. I replayed the sounds over and over. The scuff of footsteps that didn't belong to me, the shadows that moved against the walls, the creak of the door swinging open. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I checked the camera bag, everything was there, and realized I hadn't taken a single photograph without my hands trembling. Eventually, I started the car and drove back toward the center of town. The streets were quiet, the few houses dark, and the air held the faint smell of wood smoke from chimneys. I found a small diner still open, ordered coffee, and sat staring out the window at the empty streets. I couldn't shake the tension in my body. It took hours before I felt steady enough to drive back to the main road. The mill faded in the rearview mirror, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Later, after I returned to my dorm, I went through the photos. Most were ruined by blur, camera shake, and low light, but a few showed textures and angles I hadn't noticed in the moment. There was no evidence of anyone else in the building, no figures hiding in the shadows. Nothing in the photographs explained what I had heard, what I had felt. I realized then that the fear had come not from something tangible, but from being completely alone in a space designed for activity, for people, for work that had ended decades ago. The mill wasn't haunted, it was empty, and emptiness has a weight of its own. I returned to Cedar Hollow once more during daylight for a better, calmer look. The building was still imposing, but without darkness pressing in, it was just a ruin. Dusty floors, rusted machinery, broken windows. Nothing moved except the wind through the trees and the occasional bird calling from the roof beams. I walked through every room, measured the spaces for my project, and finally understood. The fear I had felt wasn't magic or ghosts. It was the result of isolation, of instinct, of a mind interpreting every sound in an empty, echoing building as a threat. I finished the photographs, the project, and the semester without incident. I never drove to the mill at night again. The memory stayed with me, but in time it became less frightening and more instructive. I learned that fear is as much about perception and context as it is about reality, and sometimes the most terrifying moments come from knowing that nothing, no one is there, but your mind is still convinced there is. I parked on the edge of the old hospital lot just after midnight. The snow was crusted over with ice patches, and the wind came down the road in gusts that rattled the thin metal signs along the fence. The building itself had been closed for more than a decade, a hulking brick shell that leaned into its own shadows, windows dark and cracked, some boarded up entirely. I had scoped the place during the day, just walking the perimeter, and the more I looked, the more I realized how much it had been forgotten. Grass had started reclaiming the parking lot, and chunks of concrete were cracked and lifted by frost. The closer I got, the more I noticed the smell, the faint chemical tang, like old cleaning solutions mixed with damp and decay. I slipped through a side door that was partially unhinged. It groaned as I pushed it, and the sound echoed down the hallway, sharp and empty. The interior smelled worse than I had expected. There was mold in the corners, dark streaks climbing the walls, and a dampness that settled on my clothes immediately. The light from my flashlight caught peeling paint and rusted handrails. Old hospital signs hung crookedly, some missing letters entirely. The building wasn't just abandoned. It was decaying, and the air was heavy with the sense that it had been sealed off for a long time, untouched, except by water and time. I moved slowly, careful with each step because the floors were slick and uneven. I passed room after room of emptiness, the furniture either gone or rotting, leaving only outlines where beds had been bolted to the floor. The smell changed as I went deeper, the sharp chemical odor fading and giving way to something sour, earthy, the kind of smell that comes from years of moisture settling into floorboards and walls. My flashlight beam landed on broken tiles and a rusted sink. I could see graffiti scrawled in corners, likely from kids who had come through before, but it felt out of place, almost disrespectful to the building itself. Eventually, I found the stairs down to the basement. They were narrow, steep, and coated with a fine layer of dust that made every step tentative. I paused at the top, listening. The hospital was otherwise silent, the snow outside muffling distant traffic, and even the wind sounded different, stifled somehow. I could hear my own breathing. My heartbeat picked up as I gripped the handrail and started down. The basement smelled worse than the floors above. It was damp, sour, and there was the faint, unmistakable tang of something like rusted blood. My flashlight swept across the room. Wheelchairs leaned against walls, their wheels frozen in place with corrosion. Broken gurneys were stacked in corners, some tipped over as though they had fallen and been left. I could see long shadows where the light didn't reach, and for a moment my stomach turned over because the shapes seemed almost like people crouched in the dark. I shook it off. It was just the angle of the light and the decay, I told myself. I kept moving, stepping carefully, trying not to disturb anything more than necessary. The basement had low ceilings, and the air felt colder the further I went. My breath left a faint mist in front of me, and each sound, the click of my flashlight, the scrape of my boots on tile, seemed louder than it should have been. Then I noticed it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like someone breathing just beyond the edge of the light. My chest tightened. My first thought was another explorer, someone else stupid enough to be down here at this hour. I called out, but my voice bounced back at me in echoes, unanswered. Only the sound of my own words returned, thin and hollow. I froze. The sound didn't stop. It wasn't loud, but it was there, consistent, just out of reach. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There was no logical explanation. No one else should be here, but the sound persisted. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight catching an overturned gurney, a pile of medical charts yellowed and brittle with age. The air shifted, icy drafts swirling around me, and I realized the basement doors that had been closed swung open with a soft clang. I hadn't touched them. The thought of being in a room where people had spent their last days alive, where suffering had been constant and unnoticed, pressed on me with a weight I hadn't expected. I moved quickly, my steps careful but deliberate. Every turn of the flashlight caught only emptiness. Nothing was moving, nothing was there except the shadows. But the breathing, faint and uneven, kept pace with me. I tried to convince myself it was the building settling, air moving through old vents. I told myself it was nothing more than imagination feeding off the environment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I came to a larger room, once some sort of storage area. Wheelchairs and gurneys leaned against every wall, stacked in a way that looked intentional, almost barricade-like. The room smelled stronger here, a mix of mildew and old disinfectant. My flashlight caught a long, dark stain along the floor where a gurney had toppled, rusted metal jutting out at odd angles. The breathing sounded closer now, but I still couldn't see anything. The air felt colder, sharper, and I realized that the further I went, the heavier the sense of the building's history became. These were not walls and furniture, they were records of pain, fear, and isolation. The weight pressed on me, physically, like the air itself was thicker. I spun around, checking the hallway behind me, and noticed how the shadows moved differently. A corner that had been dark now appeared slightly illuminated by some reflection from the broken tiles. Doors that I remembered being shut now hung open, ajar as if welcoming me into spaces I didn't want to enter. My pulse raced. I had explored abandoned buildings before, but never with this intensity, never with a sense that the building itself seemed to breathe around me. I took a deep breath and made the decision to leave. My boots slipped slightly on wet patches as I climbed the stairs, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The hallways seemed longer than they had before, and every creak and groan of the old building felt magnified. I reached the main floor and paused at the doorway to the lobby. The wind outside was quieter now, but it carried with it the smell of frozen earth. I looked back at the darkened stairwell, the basement hidden below, and realized that whatever had drawn me there was not something I could explain or capture. It was simply the residue of the building, the atmosphere of decades of suffering left embedded in its walls. I stepped out into the night, the cold air hitting my face like a shock. My heart was still racing, but the sense of pressure lifted the further I moved away. The snow crunched beneath my boots, and I could hear the distant sound of traffic finally returning. I looked back once at the dark silhouette of the hospital and saw nothing. Just brick, just shadows. I realized that the building itself wasn't alive. It was the history within it that had weighed on me. I had felt it because I was alone, and because I had been willing to enter a place where people had spent their last moments in confinement and fear. I drove away slowly, headlights cutting through the faint snow flurries. The hospital receded behind me, a shape swallowed by darkness, and for hours afterward, I could still feel the weight of that basement pressing on my chest. It stayed with me in quiet moments, in the silence of my apartment, a reminder that some places hold on to what happened there. I never went back, and I never will. The memory itself is enough, heavy and tangible, a lesson in respecting spaces that carry the echoes of pain, even when nothing supernatural exists to haunt them. Being alone in that hospital, in that basement, taught me more about the human experience than any museum or history book could. The suffering left its mark in the walls, the floors, the air, and even if the building stood empty, the remnants of what occurred there are impossible to ignore. Some places carry a weight, and all you can do is acknowledge it and leave. I did, and I walked away knowing that some encounters, some environments, demand nothing more than recognition and respect. I arrived in Upper Timber Falls late in November, the sky bruised purple and gray as the sun dipped behind the hills. The road leading into town was narrow, lined with maples and birch that had already lost most of their leaves. Each gust of wind rattled the remaining branches, sending a cold whisper across the empty asphalt. I parked at the edge of the small lot near the old water mill, the one locals always mentioned when they spoke of the shadow beast. The mill had been abandoned for decades, its wheel frozen in place, the boards darkened by years of rain and neglect. I stepped out, boots crunching on the thin layer of frost coating the fallen leaves, and immediately felt the air change. It wasn't cold in the way snow brings cold. It was sharp, damp, carrying the smell of wet wood and river mud. I walked toward the river, keeping close to the overgrown path that ran along the mill. The water was slow and dark, almost black, reflecting the jagged silhouette of the mill and the bare trees on the bank opposite. The surface was still, but every so often a fallen branch would float past, breaking the mirror. I adjusted my backpack, feeling the camera press against my shoulder. I'd come to document the local legend, to see if there was anything to it, though part of me had always known the truth would be mundane. Maybe a deer, or a particularly large raccoon, or just shadows playing tricks at dusk. Still, I couldn't ignore the way the stories had settled over the town, thick as the fog that sometimes rolled off the river. The path narrowed as I moved closer to the mill. Long grass and reeds bent under the frost, and my feet sank slightly into the damp earth. I paused to adjust my camera strap, and noticed something in the water. At first, I thought it was a trick of light, a reflection of the bare limbs reaching over the river, but then I saw the motion again. It was a figure, or something like a figure, slipping between the trees. The outline was elongated, taller than any human should be, and the way it moved didn't match anything I recognized. It wasn't running, not walking in any normal sense, but moving deliberately, its limbs swinging in an almost mechanical rhythm. I froze, gripping the camera. The figure paused, and I thought I caught a glint of something in its form, wet and dark against the dying light. I took a cautious step back, trying to stay low, ducking behind a tree. The leaves behind me cracked sharply. My heart jumped. I waited, listening, but there was nothing else. No footsteps, no other sound, just the river and the wind stirring the reeds. I considered leaving, turning back to the car, but curiosity pushed me forward. I edged around the tree and moved slowly, keeping the river in sight. Every so often, I caught glimpses of the figure between the trunks, a dark silhouette that refused to be identified. It wasn't rushing away or hiding. It seemed aware, deliberate, as if it were studying me the same way I was studying it. My mind ran through explanations: a deer on its hind legs, a bear caught mid-step, a trick of the shadows, but nothing fit. The height, the shape, the movements, none of it matched anything in the woods I knew. The path curved, leading me closer to the mill itself. The boards creaked underfoot, and the faint smell of mildew rose from the waterlogged foundations. I kept my eyes on the dark line of trees across the river, and there it was again. Standing near the water's edge, its form perfectly still, limbs long and rigid. It tilted slightly, as if watching me, though I wasn't sure it had eyes. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stayed frozen, trying to tell myself I was safe, that this was just a trick of perspective and shadow. Then it moved. Not fast, not like an animal fleeing, but deliberate, measured, one step at a time. The way it stepped made the ground shiver under my attention. I ducked behind a fallen log, holding my breath, listening. Leaves snapped behind me again. My pulse hammered in my ears. I forced myself to stay silent, hoping it would pass, hoping it would disappear into the darkening woods. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. I couldn't tell. When I dared to peek, the figure was gone. The water was still, the reeds motionless. I let out a slow breath, my chest tight from tension. I didn't move immediately. I stayed low, scanning the trees, listening to the wind in the branches, the river in its slow, steady flow. The longer I waited, the more I felt the emptiness of the place pressing against me. The legends had never mentioned anything tangible, nothing specific beyond a shadowy presence near the mill. I understood now why. Some things weren't meant to be caught or explained, and some stories existed to keep people away. I moved back along the path, deliberately slow at first, then faster as my confidence returned. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting the shadow to reappear. Nothing did. The path widened near the lot, and I could see my car, the headlights catching the frost on the leaves. I didn't stop until I was inside, doors locked, hands trembling as I set the camera down on the seat. I didn't review the footage. I didn't want to know if the shadows on the riverbank had been real or imagined. Driving away, I kept the windows closed despite the cold, the road curling through bare hills and frozen streams. The town fell behind me, the stories of the shadow beast pressing into the silence of the night. I understood something essential. Upper Timber Falls had its secret, a presence that needed no explanation, no evidence. It wasn't supernatural, it wasn't a ghost or monster in the way stories told in other towns claimed. It was something else entirely, something grounded in the woods, deliberate, patient, and aware. By the time I reached the main road, my hands had stopped shaking. I kept glancing at the tree line in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it again. Nothing appeared, and I realized that was the point. Some things in the woods were real enough to make you believe, but they didn't need to show themselves completely. They existed in the corners of your vision, in the quiet sounds, in the way the frost cracked under your feet. I never returned to Upper Timber Falls. I didn't need to. I understood now that curiosity didn't always reward you with answers. Some truths are better left in shadow, unproven, unsettling, but entirely real. I first heard about the carnival from an old online forum where people shared stories about abandoned places around Michigan. The post had grainy pictures of a Ferris wheel barely visible through overgrown trees and weeds curling around the rusted metal. The writer called it the Forgotten Carnival, said it had been closed for decades, and warned it was easy to get lost there. My friends and I were curious, the kind of curiosity that felt harmless at first, a weekend adventure on the edge of Coldwater. We arrived in late September, when the nights come early and the air has a damp bite to it, and the sun was gone long before we reached the gravel turnoff that led to the carnival. The road was lined with brittle cornfields, tall stalks rattling in the wind. We parked at the edge of a broken fence, our headlights cutting through the mist that hovered low over the grass. The first thing that hit us was the smell. Not rotten exactly, more like the sharp, iron-laced scent of rust mixed with damp wood and soil that had been undisturbed for years. Beyond the fence, the carnival sprawled across a clearing. The rides leaned at odd angles, Ferris wheel cars tilted as if frozen mid-spin, the swing sets swaying slowly, even though the air was still. A carousel sat in the center, its colors dulled to gray, the horses chipped and flaking. We joked about hauntings, about how it would make a perfect backdrop for some horror story. But the jokes felt hollow against the silence that stretched across the carnival. The normal noises of the night were gone. No crickets, no distant cars, just the soft whistle of wind threading through metal and torn canvas. We moved slowly, each step crunching over gravel and dry leaves. One of the tents sagged in the middle, the canvas ripped, exposing poles bent like broken bones. The air was cooler inside, slightly musty, and the shadows seemed thicker, more defined. I could feel the hairs on my arms rise, even as I told myself it was just the cold. The carousel caught my attention first. I swore I heard music, faint and warped, like a record played too slowly. The sound had no source. There were no speakers, no electrical lines. Just that distorted, tinny melody that made the air feel sticky. I glanced at my friends. One of them paused, head tilted, staring at the horses as if they might move. Another pointed vaguely toward the Ferris wheel, where a shape loomed between the supports. It was tall, unnaturally still, and the reflection from a low moon made two bright spots where its eyes might have been, though I knew they weren't eyes. My heart started thumping, not with fear of anything supernatural, just the raw unease of being in a place that time had forgotten, of knowing that something could be there, and we would not see it clearly until it was too close. The paths between the tents were narrow now, overgrown with weeds and thorny brush. Every step snagged on shoes or tore at clothes, branches reaching out as if the carnival itself wanted to slow us down. We didn't speak. It didn't feel right to speak. The air smelled different with every step. In some places it was damp and earthy. In others it had the metallic bite of corroded iron. The structures groaned under the wind. A tent flap whipped suddenly, making a loud crack that echoed across the clearing. I jumped, as did the others. It was only fabric and poles, but the sound seemed alive, resonating in the fog. As we neared the Ferris wheel, the shape became clearer. Not clearly a person, not clearly an animal, just something tall and still, blending into the dark lattice of metal. My stomach twisted. We turned away slowly, moving back down the path, and that's when the carousel music became louder. Not loud, but present enough to make the hair on the back of my neck spike. It was a warped wail now, and every note seemed slightly off, like a memory played incorrectly. I couldn't explain why it felt alive, why I kept glancing over my shoulder. Every time I looked, the shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, folding over themselves. I told myself it was my imagination, the shapes of twisted metal, the branches, the moonlight. I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. The farther we went, the more distorted the carnival became. Shapes that had been recognizable, a ride, a tent, a stand, stretched and twisted at the edges of my vision. The Ferris wheel, which should have been stationary, looked like it might lean slightly, and then snap back. I felt dizzy, unsteady. We all did. The ground seemed uneven, though we knew the clearing was flat. I could feel the roots beneath the grass, tripping us, but every stumble felt like it was being exaggerated by the place itself. My pulse was loud in my ears, my breath shallow, trying to stay calm. Branches clawed at our clothes and faces as we ran, slow at first, then faster when one of my friends tripped and almost fell. The carnival was closing in on us, or at least it felt that way. Every shadow stretched toward us. Every sound, metal, wood, wind, seemed magnified, echoed back in ways it shouldn't. My shoes scraped gravel, my hands pushed away the thorny brush, and my mind fixed on one goal: get out. When we finally reached the car, the relief was overwhelming. I fumbled with the keys, shaking so badly I dropped them twice. We piled in without locking the doors, headlights piercing the mist as I started the engine. The fog began to lift slightly, revealing the clearing in the moonlight. And then we saw it, what made my stomach drop all over again. The carnival didn't look like it had looked when we arrived. The colors of the rides shimmered unnaturally, like reflections on wet pavement, the metal brighter than it should have been, the shapes somehow sharper, more defined. It looked almost unreal, like a picture you know has been digitally altered. I pressed the accelerator, and my friends looked back too, faces pale in the weak dashboard light. I didn't slow until we were back on the gravel road, leaving the clearing behind, swallowed by the dark fields. Later, when I tried to explain it, I realized I had no words. Everything was real, the smells, the sounds, the shapes, but the way it lingered in my memory was unreal. There was no explanation for the shimmer, no reason for the shapes to appear distorted, and yet I remembered every detail. The way the carousel music had warped, the way the shadows moved, the way the air pressed on my lungs as if the carnival had weight. It stayed with me for weeks. I stopped trying to rationalize it. There was no specter, no cryptid, no ghost. Just a place abandoned too long, a place grown wild and uneven, a place that had trapped our senses and held them at the edges of reality. I never went back. None of us did. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the tall shape following us, glowing spots where its eyes should have been. Nothing appeared. The carnival remained behind in its clearing, exactly as we had left it, but somehow altered, shimmering in the memory of headlights and fog. I told friends later it was an abandoned site, nothing more, and they laughed, shrugged it off. But I know what we saw. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't alive. It was just abandoned, forgotten, and somehow in the right or wrong conditions, it could make your mind see more than it should. Even now, when I think about it, I can feel the brush of branches on my arms, hear the distorted carousel music faintly at the edge of memory. I can see the shimmer of the rides if I close my eyes. The forgotten carnival wasn't haunted, but it was enough to make you feel hunted, enough to make you believe in shapes that weren't there. It taught me that some places carry the weight of time, neglect, and isolation so heavily that reality itself bends slightly. And for one night, we were trapped inside it, helpless, running, and finally leaving, gasping and shaken, but alive. And that was enough. We never spoke about it much after that. We didn't need to. The memory was clear enough, sharp and unnerving, enough to make the place unforgettable even as it faded into the distance behind us. I had planned to spend the morning near Pine Creek, testing a new camera drone I had just bought. The trail I chose was lightly used, tucked into the forest away from any marked paths, and I wanted the quiet, the sense of being completely alone. The early July air was damp and cool, and mist lingered low over the underbrush, curling around the trunks of spruce and fir. The forest smelled sharply of wet pine and earth, and the light that filtered through the canopy was pale and diffuse, softening the edges of the trees but making shadows deeper, darker. I moved carefully, keeping an eye on the trail, balancing my pack and camera equipment. The first hour passed without incident. The trail was narrow and uneven, with roots and rocks jutting up, and I had to step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. I was alert but relaxed, letting my drone lift off and hover above me, testing its responsiveness while I walked. It gave me a sense of space, letting me see the trail ahead from above, the patterns of the forest floor in ways I hadn't noticed before. The mist made everything seem distant, muted, and I felt a calm sort of solitude I hadn't experienced in months. After about 3 hours, I began to notice things that didn't sit right. It started with a subtle movement, a shift in the corner of my eye. I turned my head sharply, scanning the trees, and saw a figure between the trunks. It was humanoid, upright, but something about it was off. Its limbs seemed slightly too long, its movement deliberate and measured in a way that didn't match the way a person would move through dense forest. I froze for a moment, trying to convince myself it was another hiker, or perhaps a trick of the light. I took a few cautious steps toward it, but when I moved closer, the figure was gone. There was nothing but mist and trees, and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I tried to shake off the unease and continued walking, telling myself I was imagining it. But then I began to hear snapping branches behind me, just beyond the reach of my vision. It wasn't the kind of sound made by small animals. These were deliberate, heavy, and precise, as if something large was moving through the forest carefully but with purpose. I stopped to listen, straining my ears, and the sounds ceased. I started walking again, and the snapping returned. I never saw the source, but it felt close, just beyond the tree line. Every instinct I had told me to leave, but curiosity kept me moving. The forest around me seemed to change subtly as the day went on. The sun climbed higher, but the canopy was thick, and light struggled to reach the ground. Shadows shifted in ways that didn't make sense, and I noticed myself passing familiar landmarks multiple times. A mossy clearing that should have been unique appeared 3 separate times, each visit feeling exactly the same. I had walked straight paths, paying attention to the trail markers I thought I had passed, but somehow I kept returning to the same spot. The ground was soft with pine needles and moss, the smell of wet earth stronger here than anywhere else. I sank slightly with each step, leaving prints that were quickly reclaimed by the forest floor. I began to feel a rising tension in my chest. It was subtle at first, a quiet awareness that I was being watched, followed by a pressing certainty that I was not alone. The forest sounds became sharper, more insistent. Birds were unusually silent, and even the wind seemed muffled. Every crackle of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I stopped using my drone, letting it fall to my pack, unwilling to risk drawing attention or revealing my position. I moved cautiously, scanning every shadow, every glimpse of movement in the mist. Time began to stretch strangely. Minutes felt like hours, and the trail seemed to loop endlessly. I tried to mark my path, stacking small stones and breaking branches, but I realized quickly that the forest swallowed these signs. I could see them, faintly, but when I returned to them minutes later, they were gone or had been rearranged. The moss had been disturbed in ways I hadn't done, subtle depressions in the ground that suggested deliberate movement, as if something had been tracking me. The figure appeared again, briefly, far ahead. I saw it between two spruce trees, tall and unervingly humanoid, with limbs that didn't bend quite right. It moved fluidly, silently, and when I adjusted my eyes to focus, it vanished. I tried following, moving quickly but carefully, only to arrive at the same mossy clearing. It was impossible. I hadn't walked in circles intentionally, but every straight path I took led me back here. The forest had become disorienting, almost oppressive, and the mist thickened as if it were a living presence. My heart began to pound, a steady thrum that matched each snap of distant branches. The sun was high now, but the forest seemed darker, shadows pooling in corners where light should have reached. I tried to keep a calm rhythm, walking slowly, breathing steadily, but the awareness of being watched never left. Every step was measured, every glance over my shoulder deliberate, and yet I couldn't see what followed. It didn't feel like fear of something supernatural. It was a physical presence, something that existed in the space around me, observing, waiting. I decided to leave the trail. I moved off the path, trying to navigate toward what I remembered as the edge of the forest. I relied on landmarks I thought I had seen earlier: a fallen log, a rock with moss climbing its sides, a bend in a stream. Each time I reached one of these features, I felt the same pull, the same strange loop of familiarity. The forest felt alive, aware of me, and I realized with growing unease that I had been moving under observation for hours. The snapping branches, the subtle displacements of moss and leaves, all indicated that something had been keeping pace just beyond my vision. By mid-afternoon, I had reached the point where I finally admitted defeat. I was exhausted, sweaty, and my pack felt heavier than ever. I turned back to retrace my steps carefully, paying attention to subtle shifts in terrain that might indicate a way out. The figure did not appear again, but the sense of being followed persisted. Every few steps, I thought I saw movement in the mist, shadows that stretched unnaturally, hints of something large just out of sight. I forced myself to focus on the forest floor, on the trail, on the mossy rocks, and slowly, deliberately, I made my way toward the main clearing near the edge of the woods. When I finally broke into open space, the sun felt strong and warm against my skin in a way that made the chill of the forest recede. The clearing was familiar in a comforting way, the way a place feels when you know you are truly leaving the unknown behind. I paused, letting my breath slow, taking stock of the experience. The forest behind me was dense and silent, mist still hanging low, but I felt a sense of release, a clear distinction between the controlled environment of the open and the unpredictable complexity of the trees. I had no photos to show, no concrete proof of what I had seen or experienced. My drone footage had captured nothing unusual, just the trail and the mist, and yet I knew I had been observed, tested, or at least tracked. I walked out of the woods slowly, each step deliberate. The sound of my boots on dry grass and gravel was grounding, the sun warm, the air clear. I stopped once I reached the small service road that ran parallel to the trailhead and looked back at the forest. It was ordinary, silent, empty. There were no figures, no sounds, only the muted green and gray of trees and mist. My pack felt lighter, though my chest still ached from tension, my mind still racing with the memory of what I had seen. I knew I had been watched the entire time, and the knowledge left a lingering unease I couldn't shake. I reached my car by late afternoon, parking on the edge of the small lot. I sat for a long time, listening to the quiet, heart still hammering. I unpacked my gear slowly, carefully, reluctant to leave anything behind, but desperate to reach the safety of the familiar. The drone and camera stayed untouched. I did not take a single photo. The forest had been more than a collection of trees and paths. It had been an entity, aware, deliberate, and wholly indifferent to my presence. I drove home without incident, roads empty and sun low, but the memory of the forest stayed with me. It wasn't fear of the supernatural that unsettled me. It was the realization that a forest so familiar and accessible could harbor something beyond my comprehension. Something that moved through the trees without making a sound, that manipulated paths, that existed in the space between observation and visibility. I have returned to Pine Creek once since, carefully sticking to marked trails, never straying into the old backcountry paths. I have never seen the figure again, but the feeling remains, the sense that the forest has eyes, that movement can occur just beyond perception, and that some trails are not meant to be walked alone. Even now, months later, I recall the mossy clearing, the soft give of pine needles underfoot, the mist curling around tree trunks like smoke, and the fleeting shadow of something human in shape but not in form. I know it was real. I know I was watched. And I know that the forest has ways of showing itself to those who enter unprepared, in ways that leave no evidence, only memory. I will never take a lightly used backcountry trail near Pine Creek again, not alone, not without leaving a clear path for others to follow, and certainly never with the thought that solitude offers safety. The trail vanishes, the forest shifts, and those who wander there are never quite the same when they return. I remember that night in Millbrook clearly, though I've tried to put it behind me ever since. It was Halloween, 2018, and the streets were quiet except for the distant echo of kids running from house to house, bags of candy in hand. I was with 3 friends, all of us 18, craving something more than the usual parties and carved pumpkins. We wanted the thrill that everyone whispered about but never dared to chase. The Halloween house at the edge of town had been a fixture of local stories for decades. People said the family who lived there disappeared in the 70s, leaving the place abandoned, untouched, and slowly rotting in the weeds. We approached it just past 11, when the orange glow of the street lamps faded into darkness, and the shadows from the overgrown trees made the house look taller than it really was. We climbed the fence carefully, feeling the rust bite our palms. The ground was uneven, strewn with fallen leaves and broken branches that snapped underfoot. The front yard was overgrown, grass ankle-deep, weeds curling around what had once been a concrete path. The house itself was gray and sagging, paint peeling in long strips, windows cracked and blackened with grime. A door leaned slightly off its hinges. It smelled before we even stepped inside, damp, sour, and cloying, like wet carpet left to fester for decades. Inside, dust hung in the air, thick enough to taste. Every step made the floorboards groan. The walls were faded yellow, wallpaper curling and torn, curling in layers like old skin. Furniture lay overturned, covered in sheets that had yellowed and stiffened with age. The air was cold, despite the warm night outside, and every movement stirred tiny clouds of dust. In the corner of the living room, there were stacks of photographs, yellowed and curling, scattered across the floor. Some were of children with blurred faces, some of adults with eyes scratched out in sharp, careless lines. I picked one up carefully. The scratch marks were jagged, almost desperate, like someone had tried to erase the person entirely. We moved slowly from room to room, our shoes silent against the thick layer of dust. The house had a peculiar weight, a quiet that was heavier than the absence of people. My friends joked quietly about nothing in particular, but there was tension in the air we couldn't shake. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a mistake. One of them stopped suddenly in the hallway, eyes wide, whispering that they thought they heard someone calling their name. We laughed it off, assuming it was the wind or the house settling. The staircase leading to the basement was narrow, steep, and uninviting. I remember feeling a chill as we peered down into the darkness. The air that rose from below was damp and fetid, smelling of earth and something metallic. Without really thinking, one of us pushed the door open. It swung outward with a long, creaking groan, and as we descended the steps, the wooden stairs seemed to protest under our weight. Then the door slammed shut behind us with a force that made the sound echo in the empty basement. We froze. I could feel the panic rise immediately, a tight knot in my stomach. The darkness at the bottom of the stairs pressed against my eyes, and the musty smell intensified, wrapping itself around me. The stairs groaned as if someone else were on them, moving with us, though we were sure no one else could be there. Every small sound, the scrape of a shoe against the concrete, the shifting of dust, felt magnified. We tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. My heart was hammering, my pulse loud in my ears. I remember moving backward toward the steps, trying not to make any sudden motion. The air felt thicker with each breath. I could hear my friends breathing sharply, the sound almost panicked. The basement itself was empty except for old boxes and a rusted water heater in the corner. Shadows from the single bare light bulb above stretched across the walls in jagged, impossible shapes. My fingers brushed against the rough surface of the wall as I stumbled slightly, dust coating my palms and staining my sleeves. The panic became urgent. One of us grabbed the door and slammed against it repeatedly. Another pushed a box against the lock in a futile attempt to force it open. The fear was real, immediate, unrelenting, and I could see it mirrored in everyone's faces. We weren't laughing anymore. Every second stretched, heavy and slow, as if the house itself had slowed time down to make our fear last longer. I realized then that we were not just trespassing. We were trapped, and for the first time, the stories about the house felt less like legend and more like warning. Finally, one of us kicked hard enough that the door gave, rattling on its hinges. We scrambled up the stairs, tripping over each other, hands and knees sliding in dust and debris. I remember scraping my palms, the sting of splinters against my skin, the sensation of falling and rolling across the floor. Adrenaline carried us out the door, over the uneven ground, and through the fence. Once we were outside, the air felt strange, thicker, almost unreal, as though the night itself had changed while we were inside. Our breathing was ragged, the smell of the house clinging to our clothes, our hair, our skin. We didn't stop until we reached the road, and even then we couldn't speak. The adrenaline faded slowly, leaving an emptiness where excitement had been. The house stood behind us, silent and indifferent, its broken windows staring like empty eyes. The thrill we had sought was replaced by a weight in our chests, a sense of having crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. In the weeks after, we never went back. The stories spread quietly in town, and eventually, the Halloween house was demolished in a controlled burn, a necessary measure to prevent trespassing and accidents. When I think about that night, I remember the smell, the dust, the sound of the stairs, the photographs with scratched-out eyes. I remember the weight of the air in the basement, and the sense of time stretching, of every second drawing out long enough to make you doubt yourself. It wasn't supernatural. There were no ghosts or monsters. It was just a house, abandoned and decayed, yet somehow alive with the weight of its own history, with the memory of people who had vanished and the neglect of decades. The memory lingers because it felt personal, intimate, like the house had watched us, tested us, and decided to let us go. I can't explain why the basement door slammed, or why the stairs groaned when no one else was there. It doesn't matter. What matters is that we were inside, and the house was real, and it was terrifying in its silence and decay. Every detail is etched in my mind: the smell of mildew, the feel of dust under my nails, the fragile creak of the floorboards. I haven't returned to that edge of Millbrook since, and I don't plan to. Some places exist only in memory, and some memories exist only to remind you that curiosity sometimes has a price. Even now, when the wind rattles old shutters or I smell damp wood and decay, I remember that night, and the Halloween house feels like a warning. It wasn't magical, it wasn't haunted, it was simply a place where history, neglect, and human fear met in a way that left a mark. And that mark stayed with us, all of us, long after the house itself was gone. I was driving through Fairview, Kansas, just after 3 in the morning. The highway had been empty for miles, snow drifting along the edges of the road, and the streetlights were spaced far apart. My hands were stiff from gripping the wheel, the heat in the car barely keeping the chill from creeping in through the doors. I could see a faint glow ahead, and realized it was a 24-hour diner tucked along the main street, the kind that looked like it hadn't changed much since the 70s. Its neon sign buzzed faintly, flickering in the dark, casting a reddish-pink haze across the wet pavement. I pulled into the lot and parked under a yellowed street lamp. The asphalt was cracked and uneven, with puddles reflecting the neon in rippled patterns. I got out, the cold air sharp against my skin, and noticed that the diner looked empty except for a single figure behind the counter. The waitress was moving slowly, methodical, stacking plates and wiping down the surface of the counter. Behind her, the cook was slumped over, asleep on the stove, a rag draped across his shoulder. The smell of fried grease and coffee hit me immediately, familiar and oddly comforting, even at this hour. I walked in and slid onto a booth near the window. The vinyl seat was worn and cracked, and the table was sticky in spots, the kind of unpolished honesty that made places like this feel real. I ordered coffee and eggs, the waitress moving silently, almost ghost-like in her efficiency. She poured my coffee with careful precision, set it down in front of me, and then retreated to the other end of the counter, adjusting plates and trays as if rehearsing every movement in her head. The diner was quiet except for the hum of the neon sign and the occasional clatter of dishes. I picked at my eggs, listening to the faint buzz of the overhead fluorescent lights. And that's when I noticed it. Across the street, standing just past the curb under a street lamp, was a figure. At first, I thought it might be a pedestrian, a local waiting for a bus that didn't exist at this hour, but as I watched, the figure didn't move. The person just stood there, completely still, facing the diner, not glancing anywhere else. The flicker of the neon reflected against the window pane, and the figure remained motionless, the outline of a coat and hat visible in the dim light. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe they were waiting for someone. Maybe they were a security guard, or just another night traveler. But there was something in the posture, the way the shoulders were set, that didn't fit any ordinary stance. The figure didn't shift weight, didn't sway, didn't even fidget. I sipped my coffee and turned slightly in the booth to see if it was still there. It was. I told myself I should focus on eating. The eggs were cold but edible, the coffee hot. My stomach was tired of the long drive, of the road stretching empty in front of me, but my attention kept flicking to the window. The figure remained in the same spot, under the street lamp, bathed in that pale yellow light, like a statue placed intentionally to be seen. Shadows stretched from their feet, merging with the dark patches of the street, and for some reason, I felt a tightness in my chest. I finished my eggs, trying to ignore the creeping unease. I got up to use the restroom, the tiles cool under my feet, the fluorescent light overhead flickering in short bursts. I walked past the large front window and froze. In the glass, reflected faintly, was the figure again, motionless, staring. The reflection caught the faint shimmer of the neon sign, and for a moment, it looked like the person's face was slightly turned toward me, though I knew the angle made it impossible. My pulse picked up, and I realized I had been holding my breath. The restroom was small, clean but basic, the sink chipped, and the mirror fogged from the cold outside air mixing with the warmth inside. I washed my hands slowly, listening to my own breathing, and in the reflection of the window facing the street, I saw the figure one more time. Still, watching. Nothing about them moved except for the occasional twitch of a sleeve in the cold wind. I felt a shiver run down my spine and hurried out, careful not to draw attention to myself in case it wasn't a random passerby. I returned to my booth, my movements deliberate and loud enough to seem normal, but my eyes kept flicking to the window. The figure was gone. I leaned forward slightly, trying to see down the street, but the glow from the neon barely reached beyond the curb. I didn't wait for another glance. I paid the waitress, who barely looked up, and stepped back into the cold. The wind bit at my face as I unlocked the car and climbed in. The engine started, and I felt the warmth of the heater slowly crawling up from my legs. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I pulled out of the lot, expecting to see nothing. Instead, the figure was standing under the street lamp, the same posture, the same stillness. Watching. Even as I drove away, the figure didn't move. The road behind me was empty, the streetlights stretching into the distance, but that single shape remained fixed in place, rooted to the spot. The rest of the drive was quiet. I tried to focus on the road, on the passing lights of distant towns, on the hum of the tires on asphalt. My mind kept returning to that figure. Who were they? Why had they been there? Did they follow anyone? It felt absurd to be rattled by a person standing on a street corner, but the stillness, the focus, the complete absence of ordinary motion, it had felt deliberate. Human, but unnatural in a way that made my skin crawl. By the time I reached the next town, I forced myself to slow my thoughts, to focus on the mundane. Gas stations, small diners, road signs. Nothing about them suggested threat, yet my body carried the tension like a weight in my shoulders. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see that same silhouette in some random reflection. but the highway was empty. No one was there. The memory lingered for weeks after. I thought about the diner, about the neon light flickering against wet asphalt, the smell of fried eggs and coffee, the solitary waitress, the sleeping cook, and most of all, the figure under the street lamp. I never saw them again, not in that town, not anywhere else. But every time I passed a small-town diner in the middle of the night, I found myself scanning the streets across the parking lot, half expecting to see someone standing perfectly still, watching, waiting. It wasn't fear of being followed or robbed. It was a deeper, quieter kind of unease, a reminder that some people, in some places, do things that aren't explained, and sometimes you notice it too late, sometimes only just enough to remember.